All right, good afternoon, everyone. So, this is going to be the 1 o'clock hour of LTUE. Our panel this hour is Disability, Physical versus Mental versus Emotional, with our panelists Devri Walls, J. Abram Barneck, Rafael Hohmann, Robin Glassey, Shannon Babb, and Robison Wells as moderator. As a reminder, please check out our online art show, and the keynote will be next hour in the Douglas Adams room. We will be having a Q&A section at the end of this panel with questions pulled from the Discord chat room, so please keep your questions in mind for when our volunteer asks for them. Panelists, the floor is yours.
All right, well, welcome to the panel. I'm so excited to have all of you here and to talk about disability, which is a topic that is near and dear to my heart and to all of our panelists' hearts. This is a writing panel, and so we're going to focus on disability as it relates to writing. There are actually two panels at LTUE that are about disability, and I happen to be moderating both of them. So there will obviously be a little bit of crossover at both, especially when we get to questions. And we will be kind of moving organically through the questions, and I'm not going to be too strict on what we talk about in which, but basically the way that I want to approach these two panels is that today we're going to be talking about disability in very broad concepts, and tomorrow we're going to be talking about it in kind of the detailed realities of it. Obviously, there's going to be crossover, but that's kind of how I wanted to approach it. First off, let's introduce all of our panelists, and if the panelists can introduce themselves, what they write, and why they find themselves unique to this panel. I will start off. My name is Robison Wells. I am a New York Times bestselling author of 15 novels, and I write primarily young adult science fiction. I am on this panel and moderating this panel, which I might note I've never moderated a panel before, so forgive me in advance. But I am on this panel because I have, for the last 12 years, suffered from severe mental illness, which was diagnosed 4 years ago as schizophrenia. So that is where I stand on this, and that is why I am on this panel. I don't want anyone to have to spill any beans on anything that they wish to consider private, but any context that you can give as to why you're on this panel would be awesome. So we'll start with you, Devri, and we'll work through.
Okay, no problem. So my name is Devri Walls. I am a young adult fantasy author. I have published 8 novels to date. I've published about every way that you can, almost. We are this close to every way. Some things in the works. But I do author coaching as well. I'm a voice teacher and kind of stretching into some new unrevealed things as well. As far as why I'm on this panel, I struggled for a long time with severe depression, severe anxiety. I also have a autoimmune disease called ankylosing spondylitis, which has been a really good time. And I am benefiting from the fact that I have healed or am getting a lot of this at a better point. So I am able to live in a place where I remember very acutely what it was like, but also being able to remember and feel what it is now, which allows that huge difference to come through very apparently in my life as to how I approach situations now versus how I did 5 years ago.
Awesome. How about you, Jared?
Yeah, so you can see who I am, where to find my works. I do like to write a little bit about kind of intelligent disabilities, things like Asperger's, things and kind of a little bit of counting. And I never really mention what they are, but probably the main reason I'm on this panel is May 26, 1992, my brother and I, with 2 other girls, rolled in a car. I came out completely fine. He came out paraplegic. And I've lived with that since, with him being like that since I was he was 15 and I was about to turn 15. So it was one of the most life-changing events in my life. And I am who I am today because of what happened to my brother.
Thank you. You're Rafael.
My name is Rafael Haman. I write epic fantasy. I'm a #1 Amazon best-selling author for my latest series, the Sunrider Saga. I've done 15 years of digital art and animation. I love putting maps and graphics and all sorts of interesting charts in my books. One of the main reasons why I'm in this panel is so I've grown up with a family where many members of my family have autism. Some of them have, severe strokes that they have to deal with every single day, and I've had to be a caretaker for these people in my life. People with, paraplegic issues. I don't like going too much into their personal life, but I tend to see the realistic side of their trials and try to add those into my stories in a way that paints them in a light that isn't cliche that we often see in stories.
Awesome. Thank you. How about you, Robin?
I'm Robin Glassey, and I'm primarily a clean YA fantasy author, but I also have some middle grade stories as well as some nonfiction. And the reason why I'm on this panel is because I have a wide variety of experience. My youngest sister has cerebral palsy, and then as a teenager, I realized that I have had seasonal affective disorder, so that's one of the things. And as a mom, raising 4 boys, 3 of whom are adopted. Out of my 4 boys, 3 have been diagnosed with ADHD. I myself have ADHD. And then out of my 4 boys, 3 have been diagnosed with a variety of things, including reactive attachment disorder and some learning disabilities. And I graduated from BYU with a bachelor's in psychology and worked up at LDS Hospital on the psychiatric unit. So I have experience with adults with severe depression and a lot of other things. So I come from many different angles in terms of physical and mental and emotional disabilities, and I have a lot of experience with these things.
Awesome. Thank you. Shannon.
Hello, my name is Shannon Babb. I primarily write nonfiction. I am a curriculum developer for Central Utah Water Conservancy District, but I write disability fiction as a hobby, and that's primarily because I have something called APD, auditory processing disorder. I'm actually reading the other panels' lips as we go through this because I can't rely on my ears alone. And growing up, I realized that I did not see myself in literature, and that's really something we need more kids to be able to see in the future.
Great. Well, thank you. All right. Well, I think we're going to have a really good panel today. I want to start off with the title of this panel is Disability, Physical versus Mental versus Emotional. That is a very broad category. When we talk about this, are we talking legal definition of disability as far as like you are eligible for a Social Security disability check, or are we talking about disabilities in a broader topic when we are writing? And if that is the case, my first question would be, what is the difference in your writing between a disability and a flaw?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, Shannon.
For me, disabilities are when someone runs into a problem with the built infrastructure. Someone who is too tall to navigate, too short to navigate. In your own home, you might have every tool you need to function as normal, but when you're in society, you end up running into infrastructure issues. That might be social infrastructure, it may be built infrastructure, but it's an infrastructure issue, not a personal issue that defines a disability. Flaws you can improve with, flaws you can work on yourself, and it's not caused necessarily by the society around you.
Well, that can bring up some really interesting discussions too, because what society determines is a disability versus what the self determines is a disability can be its own entire topic. Because you could write a fantasy world where the disability is you're left-handed, because it's a societal structure. But for us, being left-handed isn't necessarily considered a disability at all here on Earth. I don't know.
Well,
yeah, Robin.
And you have things like I think of flaws as being along the lines of like characteristics, things like greed or jealousy, things like that, where it's the potential for anybody and everybody to have at a given time, right? Where it's like a personality characteristic, if that makes sense, right? Yeah. Where when we talk about disabilities, it's not that everybody necessarily has it. We have a certain percentage of a population that has it. Everybody has the potential to acquire a disability, right? At any given time. If we had the example of a car accident, right? At any given time, you could be in a car accident and acquire a physical disability, right? Or, my mother was in a car accident and she had, brain, sorry, when your brain is shaken, I'm losing my words. Closed head injury. Closed head injury. Is that what it's called? So we all have the potential, but I think more along the lines of character flaws as being things like sort of characteristics, things like jealousy or greed. Or does that make sense?
Yeah,
I think it makes perfect sense. I kind of narrowed it down to two things. A flaw is caused by behavior and choice, and a disability just is. It's outside your control. You can't change it. It's going to be there forever. You can overcome both of them, but one of them you constantly have to overcome because it's always going to be there. Whereas a flaw, if you're greed, you can conquer greed and never be greedy again. But you can't conquer being paraplegic. You can't conquer really being autistic. You have to live with it and deal with it daily. So it's behavior and choice versus something permanent.
Yeah, and I would say very much along, like I really liked where Shannon was going with it, with flaws are something we can change, we can improve. We can say, hey, I don't like this about myself, right? I'm going to do the inner work and the outer work, and I'm going to make it better, and I'm going to change. But with a disability, especially within writing, because we're in a much shorter time span, right? For the broad stroke of disabilities, those are things that we have to figure out how to work with. So like Shannon has learned like, oh, I need to lip read while I have my headphones on. So she's learning to work with what she has, even though she can't change it. It doesn't have to be something that's terrible and horrible and affects our life in a way that is completely destructive if we learn how to incorporate that into how we handle things, how we manage our situations.
And when we're talking about, character flaws, for example, you have those minor ones, right? That maybe a writer is using as sort of a character quirk, that maybe it's making the character interesting, or a major flaw that could bring about the downfall of a character, right? If it's, maybe it's vanity or whatever. And if it's something that we're using for the character to learn, has been said, like, oh, I can improve on this, I can get better. And you see that progression throughout the story, or you see that, oh man, this is just going to bring them down and ruin them. right?
Yeah. So let me ask you this, going off of that question. A movie that is near and dear to my heart, because I suffer schizophrenia, is A Beautiful Mind, starring Russell Crowe, Jennifer Connelly, about John Nash, the Nobel Prize-winning mathematician. There are issues with that. There are issues with all movies and films that deal with disability, but that is a show where the basic premise of the show is him overcoming his disability, and that is the arc of the show.
Right.
Is there anything inherently wrong with that perspective? Is there anything that is better about that perspective? Is it just a type of story where we overcome this flaw, or are there any negative connotations culturally that go into this is a story about someone who their character arc is overcoming a disability?
Well, I think you just said it right there. It's the assumption that the disability is a flaw, that you as a person are flawed because you have a disability, right? And that it is something to overcome. And each person has to decide for themselves, right? How do I view myself? And how do I view this? And, you know, even with we have to have these legal definitions of things, right? The legal definitions come about in order for there to be, access, for there to be access to things, whether it's programs or access to buildings and whatnot. But there's still inherent problems with that because we have language that then promotes stigma. And movies that promote ideas that people get. But I think that there's a problem with that we're equating flaw with disability and that you have to overcome it instead of, this is just one part of who I am. This does not encompass my whole life experience. There's more to me than this.
Yeah. If I can go, what I really liked about A Beautiful Mind was more than him overcoming the ability. It was showing him that he had this flaw, but he was yet one of the most intelligent people in any room he went into. He was a greater person because of his, because of who he was. And this was just some side thing that had the opportunity or the potential to tear him down and ruin him, but he was able to overcome it and not let it do that. But showing that he is a great person, an amazing person, one of the most intelligent, I think was a benefit to all of society. And I really like it when super intelligent people have these, flaws, and those flaws are not, or what they call flaws, but they're not really flaws. They're side effects of what make them amazing.
I love that so much because I think the question is a little difficult because the definition of disability is so wide, right? We have paraplegic and then we have anxiety. Like that's a hard rainbow to try to answer, but it's how it's written, it's how it's presented. And my kids and I all have ADD, and when we first got them diagnosed, I realized it's a far cry from Beautiful Mind, but when we first got them diagnosed, they struggled because they were like, I don't want to be broken. I don't want to be a freak. I don't want to be the weirdo. And I've had to spend a lot of time with them saying exactly what you just said, which is, this is your superpower. Like, do you have any comprehension of what your brain is capable of that other people's brains cannot do? Like, yes, it makes it difficult to sit in a classroom, but you can overcome, and this definition is a little squishy, but you can overcome this by learning how to cope in these situations and how to fly in the rest of the situations by using the genius that is uniquely yours.
Yeah,
I want
Shannon.
to argue that movies like A Beautiful Mind are really written to make other people feel better about disabilities and are less written for the people who have the disabilities. A wonder, celebrated piece of disability fiction really doesn't necessarily speak with someone who is going through those hardships because they paint such a rosy picture. It's all about the triumph. It's all about the superhero. I'm sorry. Right now, lip reading in a masked world, I do not have superpowers at all. And if that's the only thing that people who are not disabled are willing to write or acknowledge in their stories, it's selling people with disabilities short because it doesn't make us a whole person. It just makes us a character to either become your hero or your villain.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
And what Shannon was saying there, I just yesterday I was having to go into one of my sons into his school for a parent-teacher conference, and there's a young lady that I know who also does some lip reading. And as I passed by her, I said something to her and totally forgot that I already had my mask on. But I had gestured with my hands as well. And she turned to me and gave me this confused look. And it was then that I realized she did not understand what I said. And I thought, how in the world is she navigating in-person school when, during this time, when this is something that is so important, when lip reading is so important for her? I can't even imagine.
Well, one thing that comes to mind for realism in disabilities is the fact that most people really struggle or are unable to overcome their disabilities. There is a large percentage of people that are able to live with or overcome their disabilities, but there's just as many people that can't. And that's just part of who they are. And that's the realistic fact that for some people, it's an ugly fact that, I will not be able to overcome this. But at the same time, I'm going to do my darnest to make sure that I'm not, destroyed by my disability, or that I won't let my disability define me. And so, when you're writing a book about, where a character has a disability or there's multiple characters with disabilities, you painting a realistic picture can be very difficult because, yes, you want to have triumphs, you want to have success, but at the same time, success is more of a rarity than the alternative in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to understand too, whose perspective are you telling the story through? Like, what is it that you want to tell? Is this something that is, just a small part of the story, or is it the main focus? And are you telling that person's story, or are you telling it through a caregiver's point of view? Because those are very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
The things that I go through from my experience is different from my caregiving point of view, right? And yet they're both combined. If I'm going to be going out and taking my kids with me, I have to look through my personal lens and look ahead. If I'm doing something tomorrow, I have to look ahead and go, okay, what am I going to need? According to the environment that I'm going into, what am I personally going to need? And I have to look through and look at my kids. Who am I taking? What are they going to need? And I also have to consider who's staying home. And how do I keep the home environment safe and appropriate for whoever is staying home? So it's all of these things put together, right? In terms of their abilities and disabilities, right?
Well, that's where it can be really hard to write a story when you don't necessarily have a disability yourself. I'll give a really good example of that. I have a close friend who she is really good at ASL, but she is not deaf and she doesn't have any type of hearing issues. But she went on TikTok and she started creating these short videos on TikTok to teach ASL to everyone who might be interested, or to family members who may have children or other members in their family who have a hearing disability. And she developed a lot of fans, a lot of people that followed her, like 300, 400,000 in a very fast time. But just as many people that followed her, a lot of people got very upset at her because she did not have a hearing disability herself. They felt that she was not qualified to teach ASL in a public environment. And so and that's where you get to some really interesting situations as a writer. It's like, if you don't have a specific disability, how can you paint a picture that is respectful and realistic in your writing? So.
Yeah.
I'd actually ask Shannon a question. Would that be okay if I ask Shannon a question?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I would love to know, as a writer, because I know one of the things that I aim to do more and more as I'm becoming more and more aware of how hard it is to not see yourself in print, right? And a lot of people that I've spoken to, trying to kind of address what Rafael is hitting, which is some things I just don't understand, right? And what they really want to see is, from what I've heard, just it being normalized. It's not like, oh, this is the hardest thing in the world. And it's also not, oh, it's no big deal. It's just normalized, just like everything else is normalized. Would you mind speaking to that a bit? I would love to hear your opinion about it.
One of the first times I saw myself seen in literature is actually Marvel Comics. Hawkeye has a hearing impairment, and it was the scene where he's talking with Deadpool, and Hawkeye's looking at Deadpool, is like, I have no clue what you're saying. And the mask gets pulled up. Now, it's really hard to read that amount of lips, but some of those interactions make a huge difference. And it's just those small, everyday things showing up.
Yeah.
And it didn't actually play into the plot. It was just an incidental conversation that didn't end up moving the story forward, but it helped the people reading it feel seen. And it helped people who may have people who do read lips in their life recognize that, oh, I need to pay attention on what I'm wearing in front of my face.
Thank you. That was a perfect example.
All right, there's a question that I want to move on to, because we're already halfway through, and there's this question I wanted to hit. Why do you think that so many villains are portrayed with physical disabilities, and what does that say about cultural attitudes toward disabilities? Because everyone from Captain Hook to Baron Harkonnen to the Phantom of the Opera to Long John Silver, or even Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life, they all have physical disabilities, and they are all villainous. What does that say about cultural perceptions of disabilities? And then on the flip side, is it ever okay to give disabilities to villains?
I think it says loads about humanity's need for conformity. Like, we hate anything that's different, and it's horrible. And I think we're becoming more and more aware of it, but it's somewhat newish, and it shows up in literature as where that starts to kind of flip. I was on a panel once, and someone asked, it wasn't about disabilities, but it was about, like, why are all villains unattractive? And I remember I was like, all of my villains are beautiful, because those were always the meanest people to me. And that's my bias. But I think we have those biases, and they need to be dealt with. Absolutely. I think that needs to change across, in both ways.
To completely agree with you, it's totally about conformity, because I have just as equally seen books where the bad guys are the perfect, most beautiful, flawless beings, and our main characters are like the ones that are struggling. So I think it's, equally, both sides of the spectrum, where the bad guy has disability or the bad guy is perfect. It's all about conformity, because how oftentimes you're at school as a kid, and you saw the most perfect, beautiful person, and they were a jerk, and you wanted to be perfect and beautiful yourself so that you could be popular too. It's all about conformity. Yeah.
I think there's another aspect to it that's not conformity. When you see someone who's disabled, there's a feeling, a strangeness, you feel sorry for them. There's pity. There's all of these things that you don't want to feel, and we're interested in it. We're drawn to it, but at the same time, we're pushed off by it. And obviously, you can go watch the musical of. Now it just slipped my mind, but the macabre, the things that are weird, they're just something off-putting, both emotionally, and I think that's part of it. And it's not always just that we want everyone to conform. It's that we know they can't. There is no possible way for them to conform. It is a disability. Conforming is not an option, and I think that also plays a part into it.
Well, I think about, in some cultures, a long time ago, what happened to children when they were born, if there was some difference. So I kind of look at that and go, okay, did that play a part in stories originally, in terms of villains and how they were then portrayed with something physically being different about them? Is that kind of sort of that historical basis, right? And is it sometimes easier to just go, oh, okay, I'm going to make a villain, so let's give the villain a scar or a missing hand or whatever, versus putting time and effort into finding some other way to describe? Because sometimes, do we use shortcuts? Do we use stereotypes, right? To just, quickly in a sentence, and then the reader can sort of fill in the blank. Oh, I know that kind of. So sometimes that's what writers do, is to just use a stereotype to very quickly fill in information. And so you, as a writer, have to know and pay attention to, am I using a stereotype? And if so, why? I mean, there are reasons to use stereotypes. You just have to know and pay attention if you're using it, and should you be using it or not.
Yeah, that's all great. So another question that I've got is, so we've talked about disabilities that are integral to the plot and disabilities that are incidental to the plot. There's so many instances of disability fiction where the disability is the plot, and it comes across very much as an after-school special, where it is an issue book. It is a book about the disability. It is a book about overcoming the disability. Is there anything wrong with these issue books, for one? And then on the other hand, are there any good examples of fiction where there are disabled characters and the story isn't about the disability? Yeah, Shannon.
One of my favorite stories where the disability is an important part of the plot, but you tend to forget about it until it starts popping up. I love the How to Train Your Dragon, the movie series. The two main characters have disabilities, and it plays a significant role in how they develop as characters. But it's only one of those small aspects of who they are as characters. For me, that's a great example of including disability discussions and then letting the character run with it.
Well, and how to train your dragon, because the disability plays into the plot as far as like we create moments of panic, right? When like the Toothless's, tail, half the tail falls off, and now all of a sudden we have a massive plot problem that's based on the disability, but it's not a pity thing. It's not driving all of the discussions amongst the characters. It's just part of the plot. I think that's an awesome example.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of disabilities that are hidden and made simple. Like one of the ones that I brought up, I was looking at fantasy and I was trying to find something in middle grade. I looked in a lot of different places, but if you guys remember in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Ron broke his wand. And magic is so important in this story. It's critical that you can use magic. And suddenly he can't use it very well. It only lasts for one book. It's not permanent like most disabilities, but it was just this little side thing. It didn't drive the plot. It did have a critical moment at the end, but I think there's lots of little ways to put in disabilities without making them part of the plot, just making them there, interesting, fun, light, and just, they don't always have to be some dark, terrible, woe is me type of thing.
Great. So,
Robison, I was just going to say too that I think it's important to remember too that I think it was mentioned earlier that there is this big umbrella word that we say disability, but it really covers so many things, right? It covers such a wide range. Like even when you say ADHD, with raising 3 boys with ADHD, they're all different. What they experience is different. It's just when you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD, right? And so even if you are researching a character and you're researching a particular disability, just know that try to figure out what is it that I'm trying to say. Whether it's a small part of this character or a big part of the character, know that you're not going to be able to I can't speak for everyone with ADHD. I can't speak for every parent raising children with RAD. I can't speak for every person who has seasonal affective disorder because it's my own experience, right? So even as a writer, you're not going to be able to tell a story for every person who is living with that disability. You're just going to be able to tell the experience for that character.
So are there any good examples in fiction and movies and TV of stories that not only that are not necessarily overcoming disability, that are not villainizing disability, but on the other hand are celebrating disability, where it is portraying disability as a good and beneficial thing without turning it into a magic power, which I think is sometimes a deficit of disability fiction. Are there any examples that you guys can think of where people do disability really well and that they celebrate the disability? Shannon.
This might be controversial because it's not the best movies Pixar ever made. But I would argue Monsters University. Mike isn't scary. He battles that the entire movie. And you get to see in the next movie how he grows and adapts based on learning that he is never going to be scary. And learning to accept, and all of the characters around him are better for working with him and adapting to his needs.
Yeah, Jared.
So I know I mentioned that my brother broke his back when I was 14. What I don't always tell everyone is I was lazy. I did nothing. There was once this giant pile of wood we were supposed to chop. I chopped like 3 of them, and my brother chopped like the other 500. And something changed when he broke his back. He couldn't be the one to do that. It was life changing for me, and I can see that in writing and stories. I was watching The Upside, and that show really resonated with me. Sure, he's quadriplegic instead of paraplegic, but I mostly identified with the change in the other character that was taking care of him. Right? You have this scene where this guy is just, his life isn't that great, but you put him with this other person that has a disability, and that person with the disability made him shine. He turned him into a new person. He became a better father. Everything changed in this guy's life. And that really resonated with me, because when my brother broke his back, I became a hard worker. I started doing everything around the house. Every task that had to be done, I had to. And my brother was on the couch watching TV and asked me to get a drink for him. Before the accident, I would have said, "Get your own freaking drink, lazy butt." And he would have done it. But you can't say that to somebody who's sitting there, who can't move. He can't get off the couch. I had to become this. And I think that's one of the best things about, having this experience of disabled people around us, is they make everyone around them better. I know that's kind of a Michael Jordan type thing, where they make a certain player makes the team better, but I think they do. I think they're amazing and they make us better, and that was really shown in The Upside, and I loved it.
One of the movies that I have found myself watching again and again, and is The Blind Side. It's I think they could have shown a little bit more, but it shows some of the emotional, a bit of the emotional disability that a person can experience when they have experienced trauma, childhood trauma. And I think that's an example. So that's one of the movies that I find myself watching again and again, and that I can kind of, when you think of the mom, if you've ever watched that movie, The Blind Side, you can kind of see how the mom has to show some toughness, but you also see some of the experiences that he has. You think of this big tough person and how he shuts down at times emotionally. So that's an example of an emotional disability.
All right. We just got the notification that we've got 5 minutes left, so I want to open it up to questions. So let's hear what questions we've got.
All right, so a couple different questions here. Let's go ahead and go first with Bonnie Gwyn's. So, when a villain has a mental or emotional disability, do you think it's okay for them to not get a redemption story or moment?
Well, a lot of villains don't get a redemption story. That's pretty common. I think you just need to ask yourself why we went with a mental disability, how integral that is to the storytelling in that manner, and just make sure that it's done well and properly, as opposed to trying to add an entirely secondary arc and do that story. But I'm sure someone probably disagrees with that.
Well, I kind of agree. I think it's like, you have to ask yourself, are you giving the character special treatment because they have a disability, or are you treating them just like another normal person?
Well, I think it depends on what the purpose is, and it really depends on your storyline. Why did they turn into a villain in the first place? So it really, I'm going to go with it depends.
Yeah, I really like what Robin said. Why did they turn into a villain in the first place? Remember, diamonds are made by putting a lot of pressure and heat on something, and half the time they don't become diamonds, they crack and are just broken up. And that's kind of the idea of a villain, is they're someone who's had all of this heat and pressure put on them, and they did not become diamonds. And so a lot of times we use, disabilities to add to that heat and pressure. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, as long as we pay attention that we're not, contributing to society's dislike for people with disability and their aversion to it.
There's a huge difference between a redemptive arc and just having sympathy for your villain, which is addressing the heat and pressure that they just talked about.
Was there another question?
Yes, we'll go ahead and make this one the last one. So, what are your thoughts on characters having disabilities because of supernatural elements? Something along the lines of depression caused by a curse, or diagnosed schizophrenia due to seeing another world, especially if it's something that could be broken or cured. And that's from Laurels and Roses.
That's a huge question.
Yeah, it is. It's big. I think we see that throughout, we see people who have been cursed, people who, throughout the fantasy element. And especially with like witches and things, we always see someone who is cursed and their life can just slowly deteriorate. I think it works well, and I think everyone enjoys it.
I mean, the closest thing I can think of, like in real life, to that is like someone suffering PTSD from like coming home from war. I mean, it's not necessarily supernatural, but it can be done realistically, and it's something that if I read about in a book, I would think, oh, this is a very interesting or a unique take on a disability. I would find that an interesting read. So,
I don't know. I think it kind of again depends on what the you kind of have to ask yourself, okay, what is this the only path I can take? Is there another path? Because you also want to look at what is the impact of my story going to be? How does that make sense? Like, why in particular would I be choosing this particular outcome for the curse? Because when we look at the community, those who have disabilities, there are already so many barriers, and there are already so many things in books and media and whatnot that are perpetuating stereotypes. And so we want to, as authors, as creators, make sure that whatever we're putting out there, make sure that it's not going to continue to perpetuate, if that makes sense. And that goes with anything. That goes with whatever it is that we're creating, is to just be looking at what we're doing. Am I using a stereotype? And if so, what is it that I'm using? And how am I using it? If that makes sense.
I think we'll end there, but I want to go around the panel and just pimp your books. Whatever you've got coming out next, or whatever you've just recently come out with, tell us about what you've got going on. We'll start with you, Devri.
I've got the Venator series, book 3 just released. Working on book 4, and I want to give time for everyone else, so that's what I got. DevriWalls.com, easy to find.
Jared, what have you got?
Yep. So right up here, you can see https abrambarneck.com is my website. My Trinity of Mind series is an urban fantasy. It does touch on both a little bit of paraplegia and PTSD, and a little bit of autism, even though I don't mention that word ever. This is a epic fantasy. It has nothing to do with that. It's a novella. And book 3 of my Trinity of Mind series is coming out, so give it a read.
Rafael?
I just recently finished my series, The Sunrider Saga. You can find it on Amazon. Currently, I am working on another epic fantasy series where the main character is a woman who is an alchemist, and she is bound to a wheelchair, and so her alchemy setup is built into her wheelchair.
Nice.
You can find. Yep.
Robin?
I just been having fun making some notebooks on Amazon. So this one is Anxiety Cat, and this one is Nope Cat, who knows his boundaries. So these are just kind of fun notebooks, and there's a few others. So you can look for those on Amazon.
That's awesome. Shannon, what have you got?
All the curriculum that I write can be found at cuwcd.com under the School Curriculum tab.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. I don't have anything coming out in the near future, so thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for the wonderful discussion. I think we've had a really good time. There will be another disability panel tomorrow, so if you're more interested in getting into some nitty-gritty details, please join us for that one, and some of these panelists will be on that as well. Thanks so much, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, Robison.
Yeah.
Thank you.